have so many memories from when I was growing up that it's hard to put everything in order. I remember playing with blocks and toy horses for hours on end. When Saturday morning came, I always looked forward to all the cartoons and favorite programs on our black and white television. It was in a blonde cabinet that had 2 doors that opened. I sat and watched Fury, Sky King, Zorro, and Ed Sullivan. I was born in the late 1940s, Beaver County, PA. In my youth, I played with the neighbors' children. We walked the deer trails through the woods and explored the sawmills for treasure. Sometimes I would go to the creek, skip stones, or look for salamanders. Then I would hunt in the shade for the soft nicotina leaves so I could dry them in the sun. While walking down a dirt path to the creek, I once saw a family of baby snakes crawling around the tree roots by the trail. I walked a little faster down to the creek. In the spring, my dad would take my sister and I to the fields behind our home. He tied a string of rags to a kite and let it fly up in the air. He showed us how to send up messages by poking a hole in a piece of paper and putting it on the string. It was so blustery in early March that when the paper caught the wind, it would scurry up the string, propelled by the breeze. Our milk was delivered from the Nichols Dairy milkman and our bread from Keystone. A couple doors down from us lived a Jewel Tea man. I went to his home to sell Girl Scout cookies. I went alone, with nothing more than my order sheet. Back then, people didn't fear strangers. When summer came, I had to tend a flower garden for school. My dad taught me how to weed and hoe the garden, how to transplant roses and replant the dahlias and gladiolas that we dug up from the previous fall. We had blueberries, raspberries, and even a cherry tree. There were plenty of corn, potatoes, broccoli, carrots, and other vegetables. The tomatoes were so good that they didn't even need salt. Dad staked up the beans. And on the side of the garden, Concord grapes grew. We even saved the peels out in the compost pile that we'd use as fertilizer the next year. In fall, I went into the woods to find leaves for a school project. At home, I ironed them between sheets of wax paper to preserve them for school. One year, the red leaves on a vine climbing up a tree trunk caught my eye. I took them home along with the rest. I felt fine, until I discovered that they were poison oak leaves. One of my eyes was swollen shut for weeks, and my face was covered in blisters that wouldn't stop itching. I was still dealing with it when Thanksgiving rolled around. No matter how hungry I was, I couldn't bring myself to touch the turkey. Everything hurt too much. For Halloween, we made our costumes out of our old play clothes. My sister and I would go to our neighbor's house by ourselves. My art teacher had a contest to see who got to paint the store windows in town for the holiday. Another girl and I won. We painted the glass with a giant ghost and a carved pumpkin. Every holiday, Dad would cut up cabbage for sauerkraut and put it in a crock pot. He covered it with a plate and used a rock to weigh that down. There was a canning cupboard in the basement where we stored the vegetables. The freezer was reserved for packaged beef and venison from when Dad came back after a hunt. In the winter, my sister and I would go out to the hill of Scotch pines that Dad had planted years ago and find a Christmas tree. For several years, I hung a sign by the road. Cut your own Christmas trees, $2. It was my first job. Dad and I took our radio flyer sled out to Roller Coaster Hill. It was a steep street blanketed in snow, because the county hadn't started to use salt yet. Instead, blackened cinders were used to treat the roads. Without having to worry about cars, we flew down the hill all the way to the small dip at the bottom. My dad would spread cinders from our coal furnace on the driveway to keep it from getting slick. Our stock of coal was delivered through a window in the basement. After it had been poured into a fenced area in the basement, the coal dust would thicken the air, and we would have to wait before we could go downstairs. At night, Dad told us about the great storm of 1950, when the snow was 2 feet deep, and the entire neighborhood was afraid that the pipes would freeze. My mother made her own Christmas wreaths with crowsfoot leaves from the forest. My sister and I would tape cards to the frosty window pane behind the Christmas tree, illuminated by the bubble lights and glistening tinsel. My dad would go to Rosalind's candy store in New Brighton to buy big mounds of Hershey's chocolate, which he would bring home to make candy. He melted it piece by piece to make peanut butter cups, peanut clusters, chocolate-covered coconut, and mints. We strung popcorn and cranberries in the tree, and after New Year's we took them off and hung them for the birds. My sister and I used to take my parents' collection of golden books and play library when we couldn't go outside. We used the big orange crates our dad had salvaged as bookshelves. I made numbered slips and put them in our family's old copy of Grimm's fairy tales and the few poetry books we owned by Robert Louis Stevenson. This way, I could keep track of who checked them out. It was these days, and my dad's insistence, that led to my first library card and my love of reading. I devoured Nancy Drew novels and Walter Farley horse stories, and couldn't wait for Dad to drive me back to the library. My parents' marriage failed. Mom moved to Oakland and started taking foods and nutrition courses at Carnegie Tech. Eventually, she built it up to a job at the hospital as a dietitian. Dad arranged for an elderly woman to care for us while he was at work. She was elderly, but full of many ideas. She brought a book of knowledge, which I hounded her to let me read. There was a trick she liked to perform. She took a ceramic dish and placed pieces of coal on it with alum powder, then poured bluing and an orange liquid antiseptic called methiolate over it. In a few days, crystals would begin to grow on our kitchen table. It was beautiful. We had a wringer washer in the basement, which I was prohibited from touching. When Dad finished cleaning our clothes, he went out and hung everything on the clothesline out back. Everything smelled so fresh. At night, I went to sleep with the windows open and the scent of freshly laundered sheets drifted into my room. The frogs in the neighbor's pond croaked as the sunsets lit the evening sky in an orange glow that slowly disappeared behind the hills. On Saturday evenings, Dad took us down to the Ohio River to watch the coal barges. We sat on a wooden bench, listened as Dad recounted stories from his childhood in the Depression. He learned how to live with what he had. That's how I lived my life. I didn't always have much, but it was enough.